The air inside the boardroom felt colder than the polished marble floors beneath my shoes. My father sat at the head of the long table, his silver cufflinks glinting under the recessed lights, his eyes fixed on me with that familiar mix of authority and impatience. Behind him, the Phoenix skyline shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but all I could see was his tightened jaw as he said, "This is bigger than you, Harper." My brother leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his pen, like he already knew how this would end. My sister smirked into her latte, confident I'd fold, just like always. The documents they wanted me to sign sat between us. Control papers, ownership papers, papers that would hand over everything I'd bled for. My hands hovered over them, shaking from adrenaline, not fear. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval. I pushed the folder back across the table and watched their expressions crack just slightly, like a fault line opening under polished stone. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Harper Lane, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived in the shadow of a family that measured success by the size of the company logo you wore on your blazer. The Lanes built golf resorts, luxury hotels, and retirement communities marketed as premium desert living. My father, Robert Lane, liked to say our legacy was carved into Arizona's skyline. I grew up hearing that at every dinner table, in every holiday speech, in every moment where he reminded us who we were supposed to be. My brother Colton fit the mold perfectly. Harvard business degree, tailored suits, by 26, already managing one of Dad's biggest properties. Shelby, the youngest, slipped into the role just as easily. Design school, corporate branding, orchestrated photo ops. She sparkled in every boardroom she entered. Then there was me, 28 years old, still driving the same dented blue Camry from college, living in a cramped apartment where the air conditioner rattled louder than the neighbor's TV. I tried, God knows I tried. I launched a yoga cafe, a wellness app, a tiny denim startup that barely lasted a season. Every time one of my projects fell apart, I returned to a Lane family dinner where the table was long, the silverware heavy, and the jokes sharper than anything served on the plates. Colton would smile too widely and ask how my little empire of peace and positivity was going. Shelby would nod along, offering praises that felt more like paper cuts. And Dad, well, Dad always ended the conversation with the same phrase, "There's always a desk for you at Lane Development, Harper." He meant it as a lifeline. To me, it felt like a collar. I wasn't rebellious by nature. I was just tired of being the daughter who didn't fit the blueprint. Tired of walking into family dinners with my stomach already in knots, knowing every failure would be dissected under the soft glow of chandelier lighting. Tired of hearing my name followed by size reminders and suggestions that always managed to shrink me back into the girl who never quite got it right. So when the phone rang one hot Tuesday afternoon, and I heard Zach Mercer's voice, an old classmate whose charm always felt just a little too slick, I didn't expect anything. But he had an offer, and I had a desperate, unspoken wish to find something that was mine. He talked about a gas station out near the desert, a place he swore was about to boom thanks to new infrastructure plans. His voice had that easy confidence I'd always envied, the kind that made impossible things sound attainable. I laughed at him at first. Then I stayed on the phone. Then I asked questions. Then at the end of the call, something inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was my shot. I didn't tell my family. I didn't want their smirks, their warnings, their questions about whether I needed help covering the cost. I wanted for once to show them something finished, something successful, something that didn't need their fingerprints on it. But when I stood on that dusty lot 2 days later, staring at the sagging roof and the sun-bleached sign barely clinging to its metal frame, the doubts came rushing back. The desert wind whipped at my clothes like it was trying to push me away. Even Zach's grin couldn't disguise the ruin I was looking at. Still he talked. He painted pictures. He promised me that people like me, people who kept trying, were the ones who struck gold when no one else was looking. And maybe that was all I needed. Not the property, not the promise, but the belief. I signed the papers, wrote the check. Walked away with a set of keys that felt heavier than they should have, and for the first time since I'd been old enough to understand what a legacy was supposed to look like, I thought I might be holding the start of my own. I didn't know yet that the moment I opened that door, I was stepping straight into a trap and straight toward the biggest discovery of my life. I was 9 years old the night my father hosted one of his grand summer banquets, the kind where adults floated through the backyard in linen suits and sparkling dresses, and children were expected to be quiet decorations in the corner. I'd spent the whole week practicing a short piano piece I'd learned by ear, hoping stupidly that maybe this time Dad would notice something I'd done without being told. When the moment came, I sat at the white, upright piano near the French doors, hands trembling, but ready. I began to play the notes shaky, but full of everything I couldn't say out loud. I made it only 8 measures in before my brother burst onto the patio with a group of adults trailing behind him, announcing that he'd just been accepted into some elite youth program. Everyone clapped, everyone turned, and my father moved past me without glancing at the keys still vibrating beneath my fingers. I stopped playing. No one noticed I'd stopped. Years later, that moment still lives inside me like a frozen picture. I didn't understand much at 9, but I understood the things I cared about rarely mattered to the family I belonged to. It took a long time to realize that was only the beginning. Even now, thinking about it pulls me back through years I spent trying to earn applause in a family that reserved praise for the children who mirrored my father most closely. Colton learned the logic of business before he learned to drive. Shelby learned how to charm a room before she learned how to hold a conversation. Both of them were extensions of my father, his pride, his future, his legacy. I was just other. When I look back, the signs were everywhere. Not always loud, not always cruel, just persistent enough to shape the kind of adult I eventually became. It showed up on birthdays when my gifts were always practical, while Colton's and Shelby's sparkled with extraness, rare sneakers for him, specialized art equipment for her. It showed up at holiday dinners, where I was gently nudged toward the quiet end of the table, while the real conversations took place near my father. It showed up in school when he only showed up to events where my siblings performed or competed, even though I was the one who kept asking him to come. I learned early how to adjust, how to dim, how to step out of the way so no one would have to step over me. I carried that habit into adulthood without even noticing. When I drove my beat-up Camry home after my 3rd failed business, I told myself I was the problem. Not the lack of support, not the tiny, persistent dismissals I'd been absorbing since childhood. I thought I hadn't worked hard enough, that maybe I just wasn't built for greatness, at least not the kind my family cared about. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 23. I'd just launched my wellness cafe, my first real attempt at building something that felt like me. I walked into the dining room, excited to share the news that we'd finally had a profitable month. Before I could get the words out, my father asked Colton for an update on a minor project he'd barely begun. Everyone leaned toward him as he spoke, their eyes bright, their interest genuine. When he finished, I tried again. Well, the cafe hit a milestone. Shelby cut me off with a laugh. "You're still doing that." "That's adorable." Dad didn't say a word. He moved on to the next topic. In that moment, the excitement drained out of me like someone had opened a valve. I didn't speak for the rest of the meal. I didn't even bring leftovers home. I drove back to my apartment, sat on the edge of my bed, and wondered why my victories felt invisible while my failures became dinner table punchlines. Every time I thought about starting something new, I heard their voices in my head, not shouting, not scolding, just quietly doubting. Quiet doubt can be louder than anything else. But the truth is, it wasn't just the present that made me vulnerable to what happened with Zach. It was all the years behind me, all the moments when I convinced myself that second place was where I belonged, that the life I lived should remain small, that big dreams were meant for children born with applause, already waiting for them. By the time Zach called with his too smooth offer, I was worn down from years of being the family disappointment, and maybe that's why his pitch slipped under my defenses. He sounded like someone who believed in me, someone who thought I had potential, someone who spoke to me like I'd already earned his respect. It didn't matter that I barely knew him. It didn't matter that the gas station looked like the kind of place even ghosts would avoid. His confidence felt like oxygen, and I inhaled it without checking where it came from. But there's another layer to this one I didn't fully understand until long after I signed those papers. My childhood wasn't full of screaming or chaos. It was full of comparisons, quiet measures, small humiliations delivered with warm smiles. Over time, I learned to internalize that rhythm, to believe that success was something you inherited, not something you built. My siblings inherited the Lane shine. I inherited the shadows it cast. And when you grow up thinking your shine is dimmer by default, you make decisions that reflect that belief. You take risks for the wrong reasons. You trust people you shouldn't. You cling to hope even when the whole world is telling you to let go. The day I drove out to that broken-down property after meeting Zach at the diner, I stared at the peeling paint and the cracked pavement and felt the old ache rise in my chest. The ache that said, Harper, this is exactly where you belong. Somewhere forgotten, somewhere empty, somewhere small. But there was something else inside me, too. Something my family never fully managed to silence. A thin, stubborn thread of hope that insisted I was more than the failures they saw. I remember standing in the middle of that lot, the desert wind whipping dust across my shoes, and thinking about the first dream I ever had as a kid, owning a small place by myself. A space that didn't rely on my last name. A place where I could breathe. That dream had been buried under years of expectations, but it was still there. And when Zach painted his picture of a future highway and booming traffic and opportunity just waiting to be claimed, I let myself believe I was standing at the doorway to that dream. It took me a long time to admit that I hadn't bought a gas station. I'd bought validation. I'd bought the fantasy of proving my family wrong in one dramatic stroke. I didn't want them to see me rise slowly. I wanted them to be stunned. But when the truth began to unravel, when I learned what Zach had done and what he hadn't told me, those old childhood wounds came roaring back. The same helplessness, the same sting of being played, the same quiet humiliation I'd swallowed for years. And yet somewhere beneath that ache, a new kind of heat started to rise. Because even before I uncovered anything valuable, even before I knew the ground beneath Copper Flame was hiding a secret, something inside me had begun to change. The moment I realized I'd been scammed should have shattered me. But instead, a strange clarity settled over me. I didn't cry. I didn't call my father. I didn't run home for help. I sat on the cracked floor of that abandoned store and felt something shifting, something that had nothing to do with the gas station at all. It was the dawning understanding that every wound I'd collected over the years had shaped me into someone capable of surviving this moment. Someone who would not break this time. But I didn't know yet what the desert was hiding. I didn't know that everything buried in that ground would push my past into the light, or that it would expose a truth far bigger than Zach's scam. And I certainly didn't know that I was only days away from the discovery that would turn my entire life upside down. The pipe burst behind the wall with a hollow crack, spraying a thin, icy line of water across the floor. I dropped to my knees, prying at the tile with the edge of a crowbar, cursing under my breath as each piece splintered instead of lifting clean. The water kept spreading, soaking into the dust around my shoes. When the last tile popped free, the ground beneath it looked darker, older, almost rotten. I jammed the crowbar deeper, chipping away at the dirt until it struck something that didn't sound like earth at all. A sharp wooden thud. I froze. The thin layer of soil crumbled under my fingertips, revealing a warped wooden plank studded with rusted nails. I held my breath, hooked the crowbar under the edge, and pulled. The board groaned, and when it lifted, the dark mouth of a staircase yawned open beneath my feet. At first I thought I'd imagined it, this hidden space, carved out beneath a building nobody wanted, but the cold air rising from the gap told me it was real. I didn't know it then, but that sound, the groan of that board splitting from its frame, was the moment everything in my life shifted. It took a moment before I could even wrap words around what I'd uncovered. The smell rising from the darkness was thick and strange old wood metal, something sweet like fruit past its prime. When I pulled myself together enough to climb down those steps, I wasn't thinking about Zach. I wasn't thinking about my family. I was thinking about how nothing in my life had ever cracked open like this, unless something painful was waiting on the other side. But this time, the opposite was true. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was walking into the turning point I'd been crawling toward for years. The beam from my phone's flashlight cut through the dust like a blade. The cellar was small and low, no higher than my shoulders. Cobwebs draped the corners. The shelves sagged under their own age. But what was on them, what I aimed the light toward, stopped me completely. Bottles. Dozens. Hundreds. Dark green glass. Wax seals. Handwritten labels I could barely read beneath the dust. I didn't understand what I was looking at, not fully. All I knew was that the air down there didn't feel deserted. It felt preserved. Carefully, I set my phone on a crate and lifted one bottle free. It was cold in my palm, heavy as a stone. When I brushed away the dirt, the words appeared like secrets whispering through time. 1919, 1923, names in calligraphy, stamps I didn't recognize. I remember whispering, "This can't be real," because some part of me already knew it was. I didn't climb out of the cellar for a long time. I sat at the bottom of those wooden steps, staring at that bottle like it was a flare thrown from some other world. Only when my legs finally stopped shaking did I gather a few bottles and bring them upstairs. Back then, I thought I'd found something fascinating, unexpected, lucky maybe. What I didn't know, what would only become clear in the days that followed, was that this discovery didn't just belong to history, it belonged to me. Because it lifted the lid on a truth I had never dared imagine. I set the bottles on my kitchen table later that night. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator. I turned on the overhead light and watched them glow under it, their colors deepening from olive green to near black. I didn't sleep. How could I? All I felt was a rising electric urgency, like a hand on my shoulder telling me to get answers. The next morning, I sent photos to a boutique auction house, careful not to mention where they came from. I used the word found instead of own. I didn't want to tip my hand until I knew what I was holding. When the appraiser, Mr. Langston, asked to see them in person, I drove to Phoenix, gripping the steering wheel like it could steady my heartbeat. I carried the wine boxes inside like I was transporting evidence. The man barely spoke for 10 minutes. He held each bottle to the light, rolled them slowly. Examined the seams, the density, the wax, the faded handwriting. Then he looked up at me with eyes sharpened by decades of experience and said, "Miss Lane, these are extraordinary." I felt something inside me tighten. "How extraordinary?" I asked. He held up a bottle labeled 1919, pointing to the wax seal, the glass, the faint embossing. A similar bottle recently sold in London for over $850,000. I don't know how long I stared at him. Maybe a second, maybe an hour. Each I whispered. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, and then he said the sentence that cracked my entire understanding of what I'd found. Depending on your full inventory, you may be sitting on millions, tens of millions. My throat closed. My palms went ice cold. And at the same time, a heat rose up through me, something fierce, wild, and unrecognizable. It wasn't greed. It was validation. The kind I had never felt in my entire life. The drive home was a blur of sunlight and disbelief. When I reached the gas station, I tore open the cellar door like someone starved tearing into a locked pantry. I counted bottle after bottle, my hands shaking so hard I could barely write. 400, then 500, then over 600. Every line I wrote felt like a correction to the story my family had always told about me. Every bottle felt like an argument against the idea that I was incapable, foolish, or destined to fail. But the turning point wasn't just the discovery. It was what the discovery revealed about the lie I'd been living under. Growing up in the Lane family, there had always been an unspoken rule: anything worth having came from them. Any opportunity, any future, any version of success had to pass through their approval. That's why they controlled everything from the businesses to the money to the narrative of who we were and what we were meant to become. And here I was alone in the desert holding proof that something valuable, something life-changing had come to me without their permission. Something older and richer than any resort they'd ever built. I realized standing in that dusty underground room that I'd been waiting my entire life for someone else to give me access to a future. And now the future was literally sitting on a shelf beneath my feet. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck. It felt like a hand reaching through history saying, "Enough. This is yours." But with that realization came something else, something darker. If I had found this by mistake, what else had been buried under the surface of my life? What else had I been blind to? How many times had I accepted a version of myself shaped by other people's limitations? The more I cataloged, the clearer it became. The greatest lie I'd ever been told wasn't that I wasn't good enough. It was that I couldn't build something on my own. In the days that followed, secrets began surfacing faster than I could absorb them. Mr. Langston confirmed the bottle's origins, prohibition smuggling routes, hidden stockpiles meant to outlive their creators. The cellar had been designed to outwit authorities. It had survived almost a century undiscovered. It was never meant to be found. Not by a developer, not by a corporation, not by Elaine, but fate or whatever force had lined up the failures of my past had placed it directly under the feet of the daughter my family had underestimated the longest. I decided to sell 10 bottles quietly. The auction was discreet, private, deeply vetted. When the final sale documents came through, I sat in the back of my car and stared at the number $1,300,000. $1.3 million. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just let the truth settle inside me like a stone finding the bottom of a lake. I wasn't a failure. I had been misled, misjudged, mislabeled, and now finally misunderstood in a way that benefited me. Standing in the half-renovated shell of Copper Flame. Afterward, I realized something even more powerful. This wasn't about the wine. This wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming the narrative of who I was. And once that realization snapped into place, so did my next move. I wasn't going to hide this. And I wasn't going to let anyone, especially my family, rewrite the story to make it theirs. I grabbed my phone, wiped the dust from my hands, and made the decision that would set the stage for everything that came next. It was time to step out of the cellar and into the fight. I dialed the first call that would change everything. My father's conference room was so silent I could hear the tick of the wall clock behind me. Every seat at the long glass table was filled executives, advisors, my brother and sister perched like royalty at either side of my father. Their eyes followed me as I placed a thick manila folder on the polished surface. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I simply opened it, slid the stack of printed emails forward and said, "You might want to read these before you talk about protecting what I built." My brother's face drained first, his fingers frozen around his pen. Shelby's breath hitched audibly. My father's jaw clenched as he reached for the pages. He read one line, then another, and then his eyes snapped up to mine, cold and furious. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. The room felt like it tilted. Before I explain how we reached this moment, you need to understand what was waiting beneath the surface long before I walked into that building. After the auction money cleared, and after I confirmed the cellar was exactly what the appraiser believed it to be, my phone lit up with messages and missed calls from every direction. When the first call came from my mother, I let it go to voicemail. When my brother sent a long, condescending paragraph offering investment guidance, I ignored him too. And when Shelby chirped through the phone about brand synergy, I didn't pick up. But my father didn't call. He summoned. A formal email, short and commanding lunch. Friday, noon, Lane Development. I knew better than to show up unprepared. I'd spent years being caught off guard, being dismissed, being reshaped into whatever version of me they could control. This time, I walked in armed, not with anger, but with truth. 2 days before the meeting, I went to finalize paperwork for the land permit. I needed to begin expanding Desert Heritage. The county clerk frowned at her computer, tapping the screen. "That's strange," she murmured. "What as I asked?" This permit was already filed. 3 months ago, under Lane Development. My stomach tightened so hard I felt the muscles pull. I hadn't filed anything. I didn't even own the station then. "Can I see it?" I asked. She hesitated, then printed the form. When she handed it to me, I stared at the signature at the bottom. It was mine. Except it wasn't. The loops were too perfect. The slant too controlled. My signature always tilted upward just slightly. This one didn't. Someone had forged my name. And not just anyone. Lane Development had stamped the application. According to the document, they had been in coordination with me for months. They had requested preliminary approval for heritage preservation construction using the exact language from my private notes. Notes no one outside the auction house should have known existed. I felt the world contract around me. Someone inside my own family had positioned themselves to seize the property before I even knew what it held. I walked out of the building shaking the paperwork pressed to my chest, a sick realization forming in pieces. It didn't make sense at first how they knew why they acted so early, why they assumed they could get away with it. But the more I dug, the more the threads came together. The first thread unraveled when I called the legal office that had handled the purchase of Copper Flame. The man who notarized the sale, someone I only remembered as polite and quiet, admitted after several hesitations that he had taken a referral fee from someone who wanted to make sure the transaction moved quickly. When I pressed him, he finally whispered the name, Colton. The next thread came from a private investigator I hired for a single-day search, something I had never imagined myself doing. He confirmed that Zach, the man who sold me the station, was closely tied to a small investment group affiliated with Lane Development. Not officially, not publicly, but through side deals and quiet agreements. The entire setup had been orchestrated. The inflated sale price, the invented highway project, the false urgency. It wasn't Zach who scouted the gas station. It was my brother. And he used Zach to sell it to me because he knew exactly how to play on my weakness, the desperate need to prove I could build something of my own. My hands had been shaking when the investigator showed me the final piece, an email exchange between Zach and someone using a Lane Development proxy account. The message was short. Get her to buy it, then we'll take it from there. The signature block at the bottom C lane. I remember standing on the balcony outside my apartment staring at the city lights, letting the truth settle in my bones. My own brother set me up to fail, so Lane Development could swoop in and save me and take the land once it appreciated. They didn't just underestimate me. They tried to manipulate me into losing, on purpose, quietly, strategically, and they would have succeeded if I hadn't uncovered the cellar. That's what led me to the confrontation the day I walked into that glass-walled conference room with evidence stacked in my hands. I spent that morning printing every email, every forged signature, every document linking Zach back to Lane Development. I bought a plain cheap folder from a drugstore on my way downtown. My hands were steady the entire time, which surprised me. There was no tremor of fear, no old instinct telling me to shrink. As I rode the elevator up, I could hear the echo of my father's voice from childhood cutting through years of silence. Legacy matters. Harper, family matters. But what mattered now was truth. When the elevator doors opened, I walked straight toward the boardroom without greeting the receptionist. The glass walls made it easy to see everyone waiting my father at the head of the table, Colton checking his watch, Shelby scrolling through her phone. A half-circle of executives sat around them all, immaculate, all curious. My father didn't stand when I entered. He simply said, "You're late." "I'm right on time," I replied, and set the folder down. That was the moment from the opening hook, the moment I slid the papers forward. My father took the top sheet and read it. His eyes hardened almost instantly. Colton leaned forward to see better, his expression tightening. Shelby reached out, snatching one page like she needed to prove she could control the narrative. The room fell silent as each person realized what they were looking at, a fake permit application, with my forged signature stamped and filed by Lane Development. Then came the emails. Printed exchanges between C. Lane and Zach Mercer, outlining a plan to guide me into buying Copper Flame because it was too small for Lane Development to bother with directly. One executive cleared his throat. Another lowered his eyes. A woman near the window covered her mouth with her hand. Colton's voice cracked first. This is taken out of context." "Really?" I asked softly. "Then explain the forged signature." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Shelby whispered, "Colton, what did you do?" My father turned to him with a stare sharp enough to cut stone. But the twist, the part none of them expected, was still sitting inside the folder. I pulled out the last sheet and placed it on the table. "You haven't seen everything. It was a bank record. A wire transfer. $5,000 wired from Colton's private account to Zach Mercer dated 2 weeks before Zach approached me with the fake highway pitch." My father stared at it. His hand tightened around the armrest of his chair. "You paid him," he said slowly. "You paid this man to lure your sister into buying a worthless property." Colton's voice broke. "Dad, it wasn't worthless, not with the zoning." "There was no zoning," I said. "You made it up, or Zach did. Doesn't matter." Shelby looked sick. "You forged her name," she whispered. "You tried to get ahead of her, to take it from her." Her voice cracked on the last word. People around the room shifted. Some whispered. Some stared at Colton like he was something unrecognizable. My father looked suddenly older, like the weight of what his son had done was dragging him downward. "You tried to set her up to fail." Colton finally snapped, slamming his palm on the table. "She was going to fail anyway." "She always does. I was trying to control the damage before she dragged the family name through the mud again." The words hung in the air like a slap. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. Every executive in that room turned toward him, not me, with judgment written on their faces. This wasn't just a mistake. This was an exposed scheme. A deliberate attempt to manipulate not just me, but the company itself. My father stood a rare, heavy gesture. "Colton, gather your things and step out." "What, Dad, now?" My brother's face twisted with shock, then anger, then something like fear. He grabbed his briefcase and left without another word. When the door closed behind him, the room fell into a silence that felt deeper than anything I had ever lived through. My father looked at me with a mix of disappointment and something else, something that looked almost like regret. "Harper, I didn't know." For once I said quietly, "I believe you." I closed the folder, lifted it from the table, and held it at my side. "This is my last meeting here," I said, "and I didn't come to negotiate. I came to close the door you all keep trying to drag me back through." Then I turned. No one stopped me. No one moved. As the glass doors swung shut behind me, the muffled silence inside that conference room felt like a lifetime's worth of ghosts being sealed away. When the glass doors of the conference room closed behind me, the noise inside the building seemed to fade all at once. My footsteps echoed down the long hallway, each one steadier than the last. The tension that had been knotted in my chest for weeks finally loosened, leaving a quiet, weightless space behind it. I didn't look back, not even once. Outside, the sun hit my face with a warmth that felt unfamiliar, as if I was stepping into a version of my life I'd been kept from for years. I stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, letting the air fill me in a way it never had inside those glass walls. Something in me shifted, then slow but undeniable, like a door opening inward. That was the moment I realized I had walked out of more than a building. I had walked out of the shadow of a family I had spent years trying to impress. The next morning, I drove out to Desert Heritage before the workers arrived. The sky was still turning from indigo to gold, the desert waking in soft, steady breaths. I unlocked the door to the main hall and stepped inside, where the faint scent of sawdust and fresh paint lingered in the air. This place, this half-built dream on a forgotten piece of land, felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever lived. I ran my hand along the newly installed counters, touched the smooth grain of the restored wood, and felt the quiet pulse of possibility. What had started as a desperate purchase now stood as something entirely different, a place I had reclaimed through stubbornness, sweat, and the truth no one could steal from me. In the weeks after the confrontation, I finalized every document that made Desert Heritage mine, without loopholes or back doors for anyone else to slip through. I refiled permits under my own name with the county clerk, who greeted me with a smile the second time, a gentleness that felt like a small gift. I replaced the lock on the cellar door myself, tightening each screw with a focus that calmed me. Physical work had a way of absorbing old hurt and giving it back as strength. The days were long filled with construction noise and desert heat, but the work healed me in ways I didn't expect. I swept floors until my arms ached. I helped stain the wood beams that ran across the ceiling of the vintage wine room. I planted desert lilies along the walkway, kneeling in the soil, while the sun warmed my shoulders. Every small act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Cutting ties with my family didn't happen with drama. It happened quietly, like the tide slipping back from shore. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't make declarations. I simply stopped responding. When Shelby sent a long text apologizing and asking if we could start fresh, I let it sit unread. When Colton emailed through his assistant asking if I would consider letting bygones be bygones, I archived it without opening the attachment. And when my father sent a single-line message, "If you ever want to talk, my door is open," I placed my phone face down and stepped outside into the evening air. Distance, I learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply choosing silence where there used to be hurt. But while those ties loosened, others grew stronger. There was Mateo, one of the young electricians hired from a nearby town, who always arrived early and asked questions about the cellar like it was a legend coming to life. There was Lana, a single mother who worked in housekeeping at a small lodge nearby, who cried when I hired her to be the lead room supervisor for the future inn. And there were the local contractors, the group of tough-weathered men and women who teased me for my terrible hammering technique but still handed me tools with a kind of unspoken respect. We weren't a family, but we were building something together, something grounded, honest, and shared. I learned their stories. They learned mine. And in the middle of that dusty construction zone, beneath beams, we lifted together something like belonging finally settled around me. There was one night I remember clearly. The power had been shut off for wiring upgrades, and the only light came from lanterns scattered around the property. The workers had gone home, and I sat on the steps leading down to the cellar, a lantern beside me, the desert stretching endless and quiet ahead. I pulled one of the preserved bottles from its crate just to hold it to feel the history in my hands. The wax seal glowed faintly under the lantern light. For a long time I just sat there, the dry wind brushing my face, the sky full of stars. That was the moment I understood something simple and profound. The cellar hadn't saved me. It had revealed me. And what it revealed was someone capable of building a life without waiting for permission. Someone who could stand in the dark alone and still know which direction to move. Construction finished months later, but the first night Desert Heritage opened, I stayed behind after the final guests checked in. I walked through the hallways lit by soft amber lamps, listened to the faint music drifting from the speakeasy, and watched the shadows dance across the restored cellar walls. The desert outside hummed with its own quiet language. I stepped out onto the overlook terrace and let the dry night air rise around me. Below, the lights of the resort glowed like a constellation carved out of the earth itself, steady, warm, unmistakably mine. My mother sent another message that night. My father sent none, and for the first time, that felt exactly right. I drove home to my adobe house outside Maricopa and sat on the small porch with a glass of water, watching the horizon fade into dark. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. I think healing happens that way, bit by bit, moment by moment, choice by choice. There's no single day when everything becomes better. But one morning you wake up and realize the weight you carried for years doesn't press the way it used to, and you know you're finally free. Today, Desert Heritage thrives. Guests walk the paths I planted, sip wine in the archive I restored, and descend the same wooden steps I discovered through sweat and frustration. They take photos, share stories, marvel at the past hidden beneath their feet. Sometimes I stand back and watch, not to be praised, not to be recognized, but to remember. I built a life with my own hands, a life shaped by choices, not chains. And if there is one truth I carry with me now, it is this. Sometimes the people who doubt you aren't villains. They're mirrors reflecting their own limitations. And sometimes the smallest, most forgotten places, the ones no one else sees value in, are exactly where you discover who you were meant to be all along.